Same question which I asked Diarmuid Ferriter when he was at the similar meeting in September. It seems to me that we can't really get out of our problems in the long term unless there is a fundamental change, not at Irish level, but at European level in policy, particularly in relation to the behavior of banks. Do you agree with this, and how would you see that playing out? You might perhaps, if I may suggest it, and I'd be interested also to hear Alan Dukes on this, do you have a view about the Eurobonds issue, or the view of some economists that we are looking at a situation where there will be, in effect, be a two-tier euro in a few years' time, with Germany and France in one tier, and the others, including ourselves, in the other one? Thank you.
But we are at a difficult moment because the sense of being Europeans together is not very strong at the moment. Every country is in difficulty. The government's under great pressure from their domestic populations. They're not well equipped to take speedy, effective action. Moreover, there are different ways that action could be taken, different forms. One is the Eurobond, but there are other ideas which have been floated at present. Increase in the amount of money the central bank and the European Central Bank has. And we're just going through a very bad patch. Now, if it isn't sorted out, particularly in Europe, we're all in trouble. Because as euro collapses, the whole of Europe is affected. And indeed, I think, the rest of the world as well. I don't think the United States will survive that happening either. And the situation is so dangerous that it explains why politicians are, in Europe, are very muddled, confused as to what to do, and understands that. But it also means that they simply have to work it out. The consequences of not getting over their difficulties and disagreements are so disastrous for us, for Europe, and for the world as a whole, that it's not believable that they will fail in those circumstances. But we're going to go through some anxious months when it's been sorted out. You can see movement happening already. German finance minister is saying, well, Eurobonds, perhaps you need to have much closer control of national budgets and so on. Some modifications of positions taking place. We don't know what the answer would be, but I think there'll be an answer, hopefully not leaving it too late. So I think we probably will come through, but it is a very difficult moment. Am I missing part of your question?
I had a thought of asking you this question, which is in a way the same question. Do you blame Alan Greenspan and his philosophy of relatively free credit for what has happened? And do you think that we need, at a European level, because it wouldn't make any difference at a national level, to somehow reverse or fundamentally change the kind of liberalisation which we've had since the late 1980s in the financial markets?
Oh, yes. I was in mid-60s momentarily. I was asked to study the banks and did. The three of the bank board saw me and the three wouldn't see me. I was not impressed by the three I saw. I didn't think they understood what they were doing. And at the end
That's
it was
very reassuring.
What?
That's very reassuring.
No. But, I mean, I'm not an expert in banking, I don't know. But obviously, it has to be tackled, better regulated, and not just here, but at European level as well, and globally, perhaps, ultimately. But I'm not. Now, banking, if you ever read what I write, you will not have seen me writing anything about banking during the last 2 years. I know what I don't know, and banking is the thing I don't know. I can deal with the economy. I have some idea about what's happening in it.
May I ask, Mr.
Mr.
Dukes?
Seeing what had been happening, I felt that we were losing ground. We were becoming a wealthy country. When we were poor, people were very kind to us. When we became wealthy, and the Germans thought that we were becoming wealthy because they gave us so much money, which wasn't actually the case at all. We lost ground, and I was worried from then on. And I do think that the present government have not been as well equipped to deal with Europe as perhaps Fine Gael and Labour are, much more closely integrated into the European system through the parties they joined. Now, Fianna Fáil are now a member of the Liberal group, thank God, at this stage, but for many years they weren't, and very little influence, and never seemed as much at home in Europe as Fine Gael and Labour because of their links were. So, yeah.
My name.
Yes,
I have a 19-year-old daughter and a 22-year-old son. Why should they pay for Shawnee Fitz's gambling debts or the German bank's gambling debts? I believe you think, I understand you to take the view that the government guarantee of those banks is appropriate. Thank you.
But the answer is that to save ourselves, we have to put right the damage that's been done, and all of us in different ways, appropriate to our age, income, and all the rest of us, have to do whatever we can, and to the younger generation too. But the younger generation really lost out in this, it is true to say. The decision to protect pensioners regardless and put the whole burden on others, and particularly on the young, is not a particularly attractive one. And if I were young, I should resent it at this stage, especially when it, makes it more difficult, university education, things like that, which are very important for our collective future. So the fact is, we have to do something, tough things, the 6 billion, another 9 billion yet to come. It has to be done, and whose fault it is irrelevant. You just have to get the money where you can find it with least damage socially and least damage economically. And all of us, including the young, have to face that. The young, however, with a legitimate sense of grievance, which perhaps some of the rest of us wouldn't have to the same degree.
One of the hallmarks of Garrett's contribution to politics, apart from the national scene, has been the understanding and the capacity to cooperate with other countries in the European Union to the benefit of people in this country. One of the things that we fail to do, and it relates to the current issue that we have, is to follow the logic of that integration. And all of the integration, despite the mythology that people talk about here, has been beneficial for every single member state.
Yes.
Once we set up a single currency, we should have followed the logic of that in fiscal policy.
Yes.
And that's the big hole there is now. That's not a banking problem.
Yeah.
That's a public finance fiscal policy problem. And if we had a proper situation for dealing with that, I'm not saying we could have avoided the banking problem. Yeah. That nonsense was purely of our own doing. But it wouldn't have been anything like as difficult to deal with as it is today. And I think the lesson out of that must be that whatever we do about resolving the nonsense, the madness that went on in this country, we set up a system in the European Union that can provide the kind of policy background that would mitigate the effect of national level mistakes. We are responsible ourselves for most of our problem. And demonizing German banks or markets or anything like that is absolutely of no value whatsoever. Personally, I think the Eurobond idea, or some version of that, has to be a part of the resolution. Increasing the support fund may or may not be a good idea. It depends on how much of that is needed and how quickly. Could I just remind Garret, if I may, that I nearly made the same mistake a second time. I, at his insistence, got together the money to build a new conference centre in Dublin Castle for the Irish presidency in 1984. And it took a lot of scraping, and I made a lot of enemies among other ministers whose capital budgets were slashed. Having done that, I went off to the annual meeting of the IMF, a great exercise in self-flagellation for ministers for finance, because you get beaten up by bankers. But I left Garret as Minister for Finance in charge unwisely. And I came back and found he had given in to a lot of pressure from other ministers and given away most of the money I'd set aside for Dublin Castle and the conference centre. And it took me 3 months to get it back together again. And it was the first serious row I had with him. So the moral of the story is, never allow a Taoiseach to be Minister for Finance in your absence. And indeed, there's an interesting story about how the Irish embassy in Paris was bought.
Oh, yes.
The Minister for Finance went off on holidays, appointing the Minister for Foreign Affairs in his stead. The Minister for Foreign Affairs wrote to the acting Minister for Finance, asking him for the money to buy this house in Paris, and the acting Minister for Finance wrote back saying, yes, you can have it. And it was all done when the poor old Minister for Finance was away.
Who was in? Sean McEntee.
Sean McEntee, yes.
Right. I don't remember any of that at all. The part of education, yes, I remember about that. I don't remember the other part because it involved capital spending. Did I intervene in that? I don't remember.
There's a man here at the front.
But I agree with the rest of what you said. I think it's very important. the point you made there. So just at the last point, I have some little qualms about it, but overall I think you're right. I mean, the fact is, the damage was done long before we had the banking rubbish, or we had the housing thing. It was done when McCreevy came in the early years of the decade, increased public spending, doubled the rate of increased public spending, as a result, in a time of full employment, after we joined the Eurozone, and as a result, there was an increase in prices and paid wages 2.5 times faster than the rest of the EU, and by the year 2004, we were lost competitiveness, lost 20% of our share of world exports because we ceased to be competitive, lost tens of thousands of jobs in industry, and nobody complained about it except me in my column in the Irish Times. I get nobody interested in the subject. I wrote about it 24 times in 4 years, I think, and nobody seemed a bit interested. That's the real problem. Alan is right. The banking thing and the housing thing were addition to all that. We might have got through them if we had not made a mess of our economy in those years.
But it strikes me that the strokes that made this country modernized it, made it so rich, as it were, the game is up now. Ireland being a tax haven, a low tax for for large corporations, the transfer pricing that facilitated. I'd like your comments on these things. It strikes me that great stroke that brought so much investment in here is dead. And the cheating that goes on in the name of tax efficient accounting, whereby something like 30 billion euro nominally were invested in this country in 2009, but you won't find a physical reflection of this anywhere on the ground. We're really playing the game with the other countries in Europe. What about the Portuguese? What about the other countries? So surely this scam is up, and the great funds that we got from EU and the cap and so on. So won't we need a real new game to get back on track and have a modern country? That's just one point. The other thing is...
Let's just take one at a time.
Tax scams and all that, I entirely agree with you. But you talked about being a tax haven. We're not a tax haven. In 1956 and 58, the outgoing government, incoming government, decided that they would, first of all, cut the tax on export profits in half, and then eliminate it. That cost no money because our industries were so totally incompetent at the time they could export nothing. But it was a very good decision. And now eventually that has changed, became a 10% tax on industry, then a 12.5% tax on all economic activity. Now, that was a good decision. Is the other countries had foolishly decided not just to tax people, but to tax companies massively, thereby doing damage to the economy. We were the only country who took a sensible decision to concentrate on other taxes and not tax business and not inhibit the growth of business. Now, as a result, we still have 12.5%. And by the way, it seems to me that one of the things about the crisis is all the fuss about getting us to raise that tax level has dissipated. It wasn't even raised in this negotiation, and it's now dead. So thank God that 12.5% tax, which is not a tax haven, is a sensible idea, is secure. So I would just...
I wasn't really questioning whether it was a good idea at the time, and I attribute to it great progress, but I'm just saying it's just playing the transnational game.
No.
We're betting lower prices than the Portuguese or the Lithuanians or somebody else. So we're cheating our fellow Europeans.
Lower prices?
I'd move to a second point. Surely the crisis, the city's on fire financially, the country, it's a financialization crisis in capitalism in general. You can't get away from the international perspective, surely. And I'm interested in your opinion, or Mr. Duke's opinion. The corporate profits of the United States in 2006 were 30% from the financial sector of all the corporate profits in the United States. In the 1980s, it was about 5%. So capitalism has changed radically, and what's happened here was a reflection of that. And finally, to Mr. Dukes, who says we shouldn't blame the German banks. The Irish crazy bankers got the money from somewhere. They were throwing it around like confetti to young people who didn't know better. The German banks and the French banks and the British banks were lending it without looking at what the Irish bankers were doing. So it may not be demonising, but surely they have some responsibility. And finally, on a moral question...
Sorry, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there.
question.
Let Dr. Fitzgerald answer that, please.
Did you pay any tax on the 200 grand?
What 200 grand?
The benefit, when you were written off £200,000, and I was out of the country at the time, but when my friends asked me to ask Garret Fitzgerald, in terms of moral position and so on and corruption in the country, did you pay tax on the benefit when you were forgiven that debt of £200,000?
I paid taxes all my life, the early 50s onwards, on every penny I earned. So, anyway, there's an issue there. But in fact, there's no 200,000. At the end of the day, the net amount involved, I sold my house to my son for an independent valuation, and I was to live there after my wife died. Very nice to move back into the house, even though we had all the bedrooms. He had no bedrooms for his 5 children. And I paid the bank everything I had, and transpired later on that I paid them the full amount, except for 4,000, which I didn't know about at the time. So all that 200,000 is nonsense.
To get back to the issue of political reform.
Yes.
My name is Kathleen O'Mara. I was a politician myself for 10 years,
Yes,
a member
I
of
know.
a now endangered institution, the Upper House. All those things you talked about, the localism and all of that, I took part in all of that, and I'm actually very relieved to be out of it. But it seems to me, and I think it's really great that we are now starting to talk about political reform in a real way.
Yeah.
But it's wider than that, surely. Political reform is on its own not enough. Surely what we have to look at is, and this is being talked about as well, happily, is political culture, the political culture of this country. So the question is the political culture the result of the political system, or is the political system the result of the political culture? It seems to me that Irish people would not necessarily give up the I suppose the hold that they have, to put it that way, on their politicians, or the local connection that have on politicians. And people talk about localism as if they're not part of it. My experience is that it's the most educated communities that want you, a politician, to be filling the pothole and making sure that the street light is fixed. Like that, that applies right across the board. And Irish voters are responsible for political culture as well, engage in political culture. And where is the leadership going to come from on that, really? There is talk about a movement for political reform, a movement for political change. That's great. But is it really going to come from inside the system? And there are retired politicians here from Fine Gael. Fine Gael is currently riding high in the polls. Why would Fine Gael change the political system that's currently, it looks like it's going to yield them, a result that's going to have them be the largest party in the country? So why would the political system start the process of political reform? And secondly, it's an involved and difficult constitutional process we're talking about, and we have a history in this country of difficult engagement when it comes to constitutional reform.
The culture reform was the politics, not the other way around, I think. We had good politics in the sense of totally honest politicians for the first 40 years of the state. But underneath that was a culture which was very different. They were extremely unpopular in what they did, in trying to clean up the corruption and inefficiency, which was a feature of our local authority system in those days. They did it. But underneath the surface, there was this different attitude, selfish and a very localist attitude, which thinks of locality at the expense of the community and society as a whole. That was there all the time. And when the original leaders disappeared on the two sides, that came through the political system, transformed it in a very negative way. It was most unfortunate, but it happened in that way. How do you change it? Well, first of all, it's no good trying to change everything. If you're trying to demolish the entire system and start again, the incumbents in the system are likely to resist that. What we have to see is what change can we make which will improve things and make them work better, but never perfectly. You won't change human nature, you certainly won't change Irish human nature. So the question is, what can you do? And that's why I raised the question of the electoral system, because if we could get a channel through which parties could bring people of greater competence into politics, so we'd have governments that wouldn't be as stupid as this government was about joining the Eurozone and then wrecking the whole thing after that by ignoring the responsibilities of it. Well, if you improve it a bit, so I think another channel for bringing people into politics, so parties would be able to get people elected who wouldn't just have people with local interests, but would actually have a concern for the country as a whole. If you can do that much, you make progress. But you aren't going to abolish the entire system and start again, because the existing incumbents, understandably, resist that. So utopianism gets you nowhere. But practical changes could have a very significant effect in overcoming some of the problems. And I think in this situation, there is at least a much wider recognition of the need for such a change than we ever had before. I put in my manifesto in 1987. Nobody bothered to notice it. And of course, we were defeated. That was the end of that. I went with Dempsey to the Constitution Committee, together, the pair of us, in 2000, and put forward this proposal. Shot down by the politicians, who didn't even have the wit to see that they changed the system. The Fianna Fáil politicians would get a 3 times better chance of being re-elected, because 2/3 of Fianna Fáil politicians who were defeated by candidates of their own party. Changed the system. They couldn't even see the benefit. They couldn't even pursue their own self-interest intelligently, God help us. I gave up at that point. So now there is a chance to make perhaps a limited change, but change could be quite significant. And there's a mood there and a recognition, even among people around the country, in localities, that there is a national interest, and you have to put some thought to that and not all into the locality. So there's a chance to do something now, but it'll only be done if everybody who knows a politician gets at him and to face up the realities of the need for even a limited change that could transform things quite significantly.
I remember many years ago hearing Jim Doug reflecting on his time in government with you and being asked what would he like changed if he had to do it again. And one of the things he said, he would like to have an agricultural economist on his staff in foreign affairs, because he so many times went to cabinet not knowing what they were talking about when agriculture was so important. And the other thing he said was he would like somebody to give him better briefings on what his opinion was when he went to cabinet, because the papers were there with the Minister for Foreign Affairs opinions, and they'd be the first time he saw them because he came in from Brussels the night before or whatever. And it strikes me, looking at it, even still today, we kind of have 2 parallel universes. We have the political universe and the administrative universe. And it seems to me in recent years, they've become more dissociated from themselves, where you have the senior public servants very worried about strategic management, and politicians not interested in this kind of stuff. They have to get on with running the country, really. And I think if we have to have reform, we have to bring those 2 parallel universes together in some better way. I wonder what your view on that.
Yeah, well, when I was in government first as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I did for the first year and a half or so try to, while being Minister of Foreign Affairs, read up on all the papers coming to government and do necessary research to be able to raise issues on the memoranda and counter-memoranda coming before us. I found I couldn't keep it up. Foreign Affairs was a pretty tough job at the time. It was Europe, our presidency, Northern Ireland. So I employed an economist to advise me. In doing that, I was following the lead given by the Labour Party, all of whose ministers, I think, or certainly all but one, had brought in highly skilled people to advise them and to assist in the process of government. People who were able to go through the cabinet agenda and raise the issues, and ensure that minister raised the issues that should be raised. And it was a very effective system. On one occasion, one of the Labour people approached me, really scally from Justin Skeety's ministry, to say the cost of living was pushed up by 1% because of a shortage of potatoes. Could we do something about it? Get a committee established. So I got a little committee established at Finance, Agriculture, and my man, and Brendan Dowdy, and his man. Agriculture refused to participate because it was absolutely intolerable that other people would talk about potatoes. Didn't turn up. So a decision was taken by Finance and these two chaps that we would decide to import potatoes, announce it. 50 tons of potatoes was brought in Dundalk, and the price collapsed, and the cost of living went down. That's the kind of thing you can do if you've got good political advisors advising your minister, and if you're open to change in that way. So, and I think the government, though I was not involved in it, my observation is the government in the mid-90s, under John Bruton, all the ministers had some person helping. The Fianna Fáil always went for a civil servant, and other parties tried to get other outside people bringing fresh ideas. And that government, first of all, that circle of having every minister having one person meant there was another level at which action would be taken to hurry up decisions, because civil service, for good reasons, being careful about everything, tended to be rather slow. And I think that government worked well at the collective level and worked well individually because of that. We need to get back to that. And we need each minister to have one intelligent, qualified person, not a PR man. They all are PR men now. I would allow no PR men other than the government press officer. Not all these PR men boosting their own minister and sometimes against other ministers. It's a hopeless system. No, just one economic advisor who knows this stuff and ensure the minister is able to contribute in cabinet. Because otherwise, cabinet discussion is pointless. And it's perfectly obvious this last government, back in the early years of this decade, that there was no collective responsibility. McCreevy decided what to do, decentralisation of the law, just announced it, and that was it. And there was no collective responsibility by cabinet at all. And obviously no serious discussion of issues like financial and economic issues. You can't run a country like that. So I think, yes, we need to have a change back to the kind of system we had in the mid-90s, and having ministers adequately informed and real cabinet debate and discussion, with perhaps some additional ministers coming in through new channels to strengthen the system.
Thanks. Could I get your thoughts on today's European Court of Human Rights decision? Could I get your thoughts today on today's European Court of Human Rights decision on Ireland's position on abortion, please?
Don't re-engage me with that. I just tell you that the day of the abortion referendum, the first one, two friends of Jones and I, who were priests, happened to drop in to see us. They didn't have clerical collars on, so nobody, the RT van outside didn't know who they were. They said mass for us. And I didn't go out, and I left the RT van outside all day, wondering when was I going to go to mass, so I could find out would I walk out of the church or be insulted with that. So that was that particular experience. It was a terrible period, and I made mistakes at the time in not taking sufficient advice before acting. But one thing that did happen, which I'm very proud of, when it transpired that the wording which I had foolishly accepted from Mr. High, because I understood the Protestant Archbishop and along with it, there wouldn't be just a Catholic view, it was not a good decision. When it transpired that was dangerous and could either introduce abortion or prevent existing operations allowed by church and state taking place, I brought the Fine Gael ministers. It took 20 minutes for those ministers to agree that we could not accept a wording which could endanger women's lives, and that took that decision knowing that we would lose, be excoriated, attacked, lose the referendum, and be greatly damaged. And there wasn't a moment's hesitation in that issue. I thought the most moral decision ever taken by an Irish government, possibly. What happened? The hierarchy refused to talk to us and denounced us, and we had a very miserable time. So I don't want to reopen this, but obviously this decision of the court, I haven't seen it, I haven't heard, only heard on radio, will have to be dealt with, and we'll have to implement what's necessary. It seems to be, if I understood it correctly, I hadn't really heard it on radio, very briefly, a decision that the legislature should act to implement the decisions of the Supreme Court. Which is a very reasonable thing to ask us to do, which they've all been afraid to do for the last 15 years or whatever it is. So get on with it.
So thank you for your participation. Thanks to TASC for organising the event, and to Garret Fitzgerald. It's been my great privilege. Thank you so much.